with our Syrian partner on issues related to women's rights and sexual and gender-based violence. Our most recent activity on this issue aimed at strengthening the resilience of refugee women and girls and empowering them to combat sexual gender-based violence. Within the framework of a project founded by UN Women, No Peace Without Justice organized an extensive field research in five Turkish districts and sub-districts in Istanbul, Gaziantep, Nizip, Antakya, and Kilis, which involved more than 200 Syrian women, men, adolescents, and elders. On the basis of this work, No Peace Without Justice elaborated in partnership with its local partner a series of recommendations with a view to amplifying their voice and ensure the active and meaningful involvement of Syrian women and girls in the elaboration and implementation of international policy and practice to fight against gender-based violence. It is particularly significant, by the way, having talked of this issue just a few minutes ago with Alessandra Moretti, that we discussed this issue in the moment in which Turkey, precisely Turkey, will withdraw from the Istanbul Convention on Women, on violence against women. The dedication and deep involvement of our local partners, some of whom are joining us today, has been an essential element of our work and has enabled us to reach out and speak with the Syrian refugee community in Turkey, despite the many challenges and difficulty posed by the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. The conflict in Syria has caused the biggest displacement crisis since World War II, as you know. Over 5.5 million Syrians live as refugees abroad, and more than 6 million Syrians are displaced within the country. Turkey alone hosts more than 3.6 million Syrian refugees, about half of them women and girls. Women and girls continue to bear the brunt of armed conflict and its consequence as pre-existing power dynamic not only continue to play out during those periods, but are often deepened and become even more entrenched. Women and girls start from a position of disadvantage, and when conflict, destruction, and displacement begin, they are natural target for further disempowerment as family groups and society, including newly formed society in coercive setting like refugee camps, struggle to come to grips with their new reality. This might not happen due of malice of ill will, but is something based on survival strategy that aim to protect, in bracket, women and girls, denying their agency and violating their human rights. On the eve of the fifth conference on Syria, convened in Brussels by the European Union on 30 and 31 March next week, our hope is that the international community will begin a process of analysis and reflection on the strategies and practice adopted to counter gender-based violence among Syrian refugee community and begin to strengthen and reinforce those good practices that are based on the active involvement of the local community and gender-based violence survivors, and will allow a real empowerment of refugee women and girls and enable them to begin to be concrete actors for change for their community and for the future of Syria. Having said that, I'm really pleased to start our panel and welcoming Honorable Alessandra Moretti, member of the European Parliament and member of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality in the Parliament. Please, Alessandra.
Thank you, Franco, and good morning to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank No Peace Without Justice and all the people who worked to organize this event. As you know, this year, Syria marks a sad anniversary, 10 years since the start of the country's conflict. The war in Syria has caused one of the largest humanitarian crises since the World War II, with deaths, displacement, and destruction. As often happens in these situations, the consequences for the Syrian women have been particularly brutal. Women and girls face increased risk of gender-based violence. It continues to be a daily reality with harassment, family violence, sexual abuse, child enforced marriage, and sexual exploitation threats. Due to this war, the basic rights are denied, including the ones related to the sexual and reproductive health services. In Syria, there are 3.6 million women and adolescent girls who need access to the quality services, such as essential hygiene and sanitary supplies. Moreover, the rapid spread of COVID-19 is further increasing the risk faced by women as they continue to suffer the worst impacts of the crisis. The pandemic is not only a health and protection crisis, it is also a socio-economic crisis threatening the most vulnerable populations and their precarious livelihood. Women tend to be the ones who sustain the resilience of families and communities, try to keep their families healthy and fed. In many cases, they have become the sole breadwinners after losing husbands and fathers to the conflict, a role that put women at the front line. They carry the responsibility of caring for their children and other family members. But in this decade, Syrian women have registered higher rates of poverty than men have. Despite significant risks and challenges, Syrian women and women's organizations continue to play a central role in the response to the Syria crisis, in humanitarian assistance and peacemaking efforts, healthcare and education, and other sectors in their own communities. We should stop to look at women just as victims. They can be active actors for change as they experience the effects of the crisis in different ways. Women must be involved in any political transition to be successful. Democracy can only take root if the human rights of both women and men are respected. More than 11.7 million people, half of the Syrian populations, remain internally displaced or are living as refugees in host communities. This is again another example that shows us how important it is to manage the migration phenomenon. We say and so that's the same situation in different areas near the European borders. People are escaping from wars, hunger, and from consequences of climate change. The European Union must work united with one soul to find a mechanism able to handle these flows. The key word must be solidarity towards those people and towards the European countries who are at the front line. We cannot accept that foreign heads of state, such as a Turkish one, treat the European Union using migrants as a weapon. We as Europe need to be prepared to face those circumstances with a solid migration policy. Moreover, Europe needs to be a credible actor in the foreign policy of the Middle East. I ask to our High Representative for the Foreign Affairs and to all the member states to speak with one voice in order to be relevant in the solution of this terrible war. We also need to act quickly because there are so many women, girls, children who lost their parents and infirms who need help right now. Thank you very much for this discussion, an important moment to confront between us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. I cannot be more in agreement with you in your conclusion and in your message. I hope that will be followed. But it is exactly the purpose of this initiative to raise these voices and try to act accordingly. Now, I am very pleased to welcome Hiba Alahiji, civil society strengthening specialist with the UNDP, and a co-founder of Equity and Empowerment. Please, Hiba, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Gianfranco, and good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be among you and the honorable panelists. And let me just express my gratitude that this year in the side events of Brussels conference, many women are speakers, Syrian women are speakers and panelists, and this is really important in achieving the gender equality generally in the world and especially in Syria. And let me just echo what you and Alessandra were saying about the violence against Syrian women inside Syria and in the neighboring countries. And we were also in a partnership with No Peace Without Justice to achieve the research about the situation of women and girls, refugees in Turkey, and the sexual based violence that they are undertaking, and the consequences and the recommendations for the international community to act in order to stop this. Let me just stop here and we may complete the introduction, and then I'm really excited to have a fruitful discussion with all of you today. Thank you.
Yes, there will be questions to you later on, and we'll be very pleased to raise a couple of questions to you. But thank you for the moment. And now we welcome a video contribution of Honorable Brando Benifei, member of the European Parliament and member of the EP delegation for the relation with the Mashrek countries. Please, Stefano.
10 years ago, the citizens of Syria took the street to reclaim their rights and called for a more open and democratic society. They were met with brutal force. The war that ensued, and which is still ravaging the country, has particularly targeted women and girls. Widespread reports have documented that sexual and gender-based violence continues to take place within Syria and among displaced Syrian communities in bordering countries. However, this phenomenon remains among the unspoken horrors of the war due to the social and cultural stigma attached to such incidents. It is generally accepted that the prevalence of sexual violence during conflict, as in times of peace, is consistently underreported almost everywhere in the world. But the added culture of shame and dishonor that surrounds sexual violations among Syrian communities creates a toxic situation that presents particular challenges. The conflict has caused the biggest displacement crisis since World War II. More than 5 million Syrians live as refugees abroad, and more than 6 million Syrians are displaced within the country. Turkey alone hosts more than 3.6 million Syrian refugees, about half of them women and girls. Not only victims of the massive human rights violations and war crimes, Syrian women and girls continue to be victims of sexual gender-based violence, also when they flee the country. With the Syrian conflict entering in 10th year, the situation in Syria and the region remains highly critical. The dire humanitarian situation, with millions of Syrians internally displaced or having sought refuge in Syria's neighboring countries, is now being further compounded by the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Over the course of the last year, I had the opportunity in my parliamentary work to focus on the many challenges that COVID-19 poses to the rights of individuals and its impact on women's rights. The pandemic exacerbated health hazards, including inadequate sexual and reproductive health care, strained mental health, and increased gender-based violence. This is true in Europe as everywhere else in the world. Syrian refugee communities have been particularly affected by the spread of the virus, with more severe repercussions on women and girls, aggravating pre-existing inequalities and social cultural discrimination. In such a fragile environment, women's rights risk a further deterioration, and sexual gender-based violence become even more difficult to prevent and contrast. The limitations of movement imposed to tackle the pandemic have forced women to spend the lockdown with their family units, even if they do not always represent a safe space. COVID-19 has also affected other aspects of women's and girls' life, who risk losing job opportunities and access to education due to their gender. The EU remains the biggest international donor in assistance for the needs inside Syria, in support of refugees and in support of refugee hosting countries. In this context, it is critical that the EU, its member states and the international community continue and redouble its efforts to engage and support the Syrian civil society community, especially in the field of women's rights and contrast to sexual gender-based violence. As today's panel demonstrates, their voice is crucial to fully understand what is happening, and their contribution is critical to evaluate what is needed. In order to better tailor the humanitarian response to the needs of the affected communities, it is paramount that their active involvement becomes the bedrock upon which we can put at rest every segment of the humanitarian response.
Thank you. Thank you to Brando. Thank you for this message, very important. And now I am pleased to welcome Eva Kaili, a member of the European Parliament, member of the EP delegation for the relation with the Arab Peninsula, and also a recent mother. So I'm very happy to have you here today. Please, Eva, you have the floor.
Thank you, Franco. The truth is that your perspective changes once you have a child. So I think it's very important to discuss the topic that you're raising today. Basically, 10 years after what has started in Syria and the uprising. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Nicolo, and the organization who holds these great events, not just here, but also before the pandemic in the European Parliament. It's really extremely important to keep raising awareness, and to avoid impunity. We need to definitely find ways that Europe can contribute even more to release the tension in Syria. And the problem that we discussed today is mainly women, since they were at the forefront of this movement. And as mothers, basically, they were trying to release their teenage children that were accused of graffiti, of anti-regime graffiti on the walls of their schools. And they became, I would say, symbols, but also a leading force in their communities, taking new responsibilities. We know women have plenty of roles, but they were taking more roles there, also in their families. And of course, this generation of Syrian women rights defenders, it has evolved in the past 10 years. And we are honored to have them with us today. But I have to say that, of course, these new roles represent opportunities, but at the same time, the war and the crimes and the displacement that you mentioned, the biggest displacement that we've seen in the recent decades, they have also increased the problems, and they have further disempowered women in parallel. So as families, as groups and societies, they are struggling to come to grip with the new realities. And this happens not only because of the impact of war, but we have, even inside the communities and the refugee camps, very interesting phenomena where there is the empowerment and exclusion of women and further violations that we didn't expect. So for example, we see child marriage rates 4 times higher among Syrian refugees today than before the crisis. And this happens because sometimes the explanation is that they are hoping to offer them a better life to their daughters. And of course, there is poverty, they don't have access to education, justice, health, the basic goods. So it's a chaotic environment. And in terms of like psychological and physical security, it leads to this worsening of traditional cultural and religious practices that we were trying to overcome. So I think that what we have not talked about is that I think Alessandra mentioned it. Women's rights are human rights, and they're not just they don't just need protection. They have rights that need to be protected as humans. I think that one thing we have to highlight is that the wife of Assad is equally responsible for this situation. And I would say even more, so a complicit, but also I would say an embarrassment for women that allows these crimes to take place as much as her husband. And also the European Union remains, of course, the biggest international donor in assistance for needs inside Syria, in support of refugees and in support of refugee hosting countries. But still, I believe there is more for us to do for Europe, for United Nations and international organizations and the community to ensure that we're going to have a better humanitarian response at all levels, and to focus our efforts on the inclusive policies and practices to treat and engage migrants and refugee women and girls as human rights holders and agents of change rather than passive service receivers. So it's not just critical to empower them with solutions that are tailored to these specific needs that I don't think we've seen before, and economically, socially, and culturally, but also to achieve political and institutional changes. So if we would commit to promote women and girls, we have to take advantage of the new US administration, the Biden administration, to play a stronger role in our neighborhood and not to expect them to intervene. And also we have this new sanctions mechanism in Europe that we could use in order to impose sanctions at least to Assad and his wife, but also all of those people who commit war crimes. And I believe Europe needs to take a lead there, and we need to start maybe a new campaign to do so. So Gianfranco and Nicolò, I want to thank you, and I believe with your help, we could actually do and achieve more. And I want to congratulate women for taking these incredibly inspiring roles, but so difficult roles under these circumstances, and we are committed to help them. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you also for having raised this issue in this very crucial week in which human rights issue and the sanction regime has been at the honor with the first sanction committed against individual in various countries that provoke as a reaction. I tell them that this, especially for our guests, our Syrian guests, they provoke a counter reaction, in particular from the Chinese, sanctioning in the individual and even MEPs or an institution to let's say to reply to our own sanction. That was crazy from the Chinese, and call now, in my opinion, for a strong intervention and position of the European Parliament that can enhance its role on this issue. And Syria, of course, and the Syrian responsible for this situation has to be among the first logical person to be sanctioned, exactly, because we cannot do anything else at the moment. So what we wanted to do to bring them to the system of international justice. But this sanction regime is still something that must be put in place, certainly for many other situations like the Syrian one. Let me now welcome Mariam Shamdin, founding member of White Hats Organization, which will be our last speaker before the question and answer time. Please, Mariam, the floor is yours.
شكرا Gianfranco.
Thank you, Gianfranco. Thank you all. Good morning, everyone, and I'm glad to be with you today. In fact, wherever there is a conflict, woman, we are also, after 10 years of the Syrian revolution, where the women have contributed with the men, where they went out together asking for the political change, justice, and political participation, the Syrian woman gave lots of sacrifice, and they linked their destiny with the revolution. And also the Syrian woman got involved with lots of activities, including political activities, social and the media, and also civil society at the local level and national, hoping that this victory, or the victory of the revolution, would give them, beside the freedom and dignity and liberty and equity and equality, and to participate in all life aspects, and to play the political transformation, to play a role in changing their situation, and also the social complex of the Syrian community in lots of aspects. But unfortunately, until now, the Syrian woman could not achieve those and she could not achieve any gains, and not in the political rights, and not in the social rights. That's because of the several social divisions, and also the control of the traditional forces that limited the role of women by justification of security, and also in its conquest to change the social understanding, social traditions. We have to focus on some aspects, the gender dimensions, and also the gender roles in the revolution, and also the conflict to participate at the social aspect. So she wanted to have the revolution to be an incentive for her role, and also to achieve justice and liberty and equality. And we saw that we had at the beginning of the revolution to get away of the rhetoric that is directed to the woman as a partial participant, and also to look for equality and finding solutions for the conflicts between the international laws and the local culture in Syria, based on the traditions. And I will stop here, because for sure there will be questions. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now I move to the question and answer period. And I have a couple of questions, but if there is anyone else who wants to take the floor, in particular to Heba and Mariam, please let me know and show. I should like to ask Heba, could you tell us more about the condition in which refugee Syrian women and girls lives in Turkey? And I know you have already spoken a little bit on that, and in which way refugee women are excluded in the framing of policies or strategy aimed at addressing their need? And what need to change to ensure that women and girls can be transformative agent for change? And I want to add also the climate that you have in these refugee camps in Turkey, especially having in mind what happened in Turkey in this period, in which at the end of the day we have seen on this issue of the, of course it's another subject, but it's still very actual. We have seen demonstration against the decision of President Erdogan concerning the Istanbul Convention, etc. There is a mobilization of the civil society, which is the climate you can have from the point of view of the refugee camps.
Thanks so much, Gianfranco. Before answering your question, I would like really to comment on one of the words that Alessandra said, it's solidarity among women. So in the preparation for this meeting, I was discussing that with our colleagues in No Peace Without Justice. And to me, it was really important to achieve the diversity in this session. So to me, me and Mariam, both of us are Syrians. I'm Arab. Mariam is Kurdish person, and both of us we stress the idea that both of us have to be in this panel because it's the diversity and solidarity among women, inter-religion and inter-nations, which is only the stakeholder, which is only the base in order to build sustainable peace. Going back to your question, Gianfranco, actually, let me take you a journey back to 1991, when the UN High Commissioner for Refugees adopted guidelines on the protection of refugee women. These guidelines called for integrating the resources and needs of refugee women into all aspects of programming so as to assure equitable protection and assistance activities. The guidelines include also, but go well beyond traditional notions of protection through promotion of refugee laws by emphasizing the intrinsic relationship that exists between protection and assistance. So, despite the existence of this linkage between protection and assistance, the two were differentiated, lest the refugee girl and women turn into passive recipients of aid and those beings deprived of will and need protection in the guardian rather than the interactive sense. Perhaps the essential point here is the law, in which refugee girls and women obey. And as you all mentioned, now the withdrawal of Turkey from Istanbul Convention is going to have its impact on on Turkish women and girls and Syrians as well. And so back to the Syrian refugee women and girls, there was a need to achieve harmonization between the multiple backgrounds of refugees and the laws of the host countries. But in different asylum cases in the neighboring countries of Syria, there are no special asylum laws, but rather the laws of the countries itself are applied to refugees. For example, polygamy is permitted in the Syrian culture and law, while in Turkey, the law doesn't allow that. And the second wife remains in any case unrecognized by her husband and doesn't possess any legal status. And thus she is prevented from the recognition of the lineage of her children. She also doesn't have an official marriage contract, and this is automatically deprive her of all the wife privileges. Underage marriage that was referred to by our honorable speakers is also common in the Syrian society, and its cases increase with the deteriorating economic situation of the Syrian refugees and the lack of work opportunities, of course, while it's considered a crime punishable by the Turkish law, and the father and husband are imprisoned if the marriage is under the age of 18. In this context, Syrian women, refugees, are provided with the ways to report these cases in police stations or family departments. But here, most of these girls and women, they find themselves fluctuating between two difficult choices. So either to report the father and the groom, who will be imprisoned or deported to unsafe areas inside Syria, or to accept the marriage. Also, but I think, also additionally in the labor laws and the issuance of work permits and health insurance, most refugee women work for low daily wages in the farms and factories without health insurance, and therefore they or their families are not compensated if they are exposed to any accident at work or lose their lives. And this applies of course to the refugee men as well. So my suggestion, if there were gender sensitive asylum policies that involved refugee women and took into account their privacy, the level of violence, injustice, and guardianship over them would be much lower. In order just to finalize my answer, I think there is an important role of the civil society. And here I'm referring to the Syrian civil society and the Turkish civil society, because this intersectional relationship brings better results. I believe that the most important things that the civil societies should be doing first is the real assessment of refugee girl and women situations. Second, advocacy for the enactment of laws in which refugee women and girls are included. And by this, we're going to have, at the end of the day, we're going to have policies that protect women and include them in their own protection. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Very interesting, and certainly that deserve further action. Now I'm turned to Mariam, asking her, first of all, as a founding member of the White Helmet, you had to witness the many horror of the war in Syria, including the violence imposed on women and girls. How the past decade has affected Syrian women, and what kind of repercussion it will have on the future from your perspective, having this experience. And second question, in your work in the civil society support room in Geneva, you had the opportunity to observe closely the work of the international community in the effort to bring an end to the war in Syria. And we are going to see what's happened next week here in Brussels. How the European institution, UN agency, International Recovery Program, and I had the European Parliament and its representative that are here, could and should better address the issue of the sexual gender-based violence to empower survivors and civil society organizations and to ensure an active and meaningful involvement on Syrian women and girls. These are my two questions. Please, Mariam.
Thank you once again, Gianfranco. But just to comment. Okay. For the first question, when we talk about 1 decade of the Syrian revolution, what it characterizes is the woman participation in a very active way. Also, Syria was considered one of the closed countries on freedoms, especially the freedom of women, but also, unfortunately, the revolution took different directions, different divisions that affected directly the Syrian woman, where the Syrian community is divided into religious component and also ideological, civil, that deteriorate the women freedom, that also has limited her from enjoying her freedom, and also allowed those forces to enforce and force their policies and their strategies of violence against women and their ideologies against them. Of course, we should not forget the small part from women who managed to get off those social divisions, and also they managed to achieve their own hopes to lead the civil society leadership. We see it on the Syrian civil society, where we see lots of Syrian women in leading NGOs, and we see now Hiba is with us, UNDP, as gender consultant. This is a pride for the Syrian organization, Syrian NGOs, to have a Syrian woman at such a position. Also, so this part of the Syrian women who managed to get rid of those social divisions, they managed to achieve their hopes in the social or civil society inside Syria or outside Syria. But until even this part, I would like to comment, this part they did not achieve or reach until now to practice their comprehensive freedom in the political field. This is unfortunate. Syrian woman is excluded from the political context or political action. So this consequences for the future. The future is still unknown for the woman freedom. No, the woman didn't take her role, her efficient role to participate on or to enjoy her equality or justice. The civil division consequences on her, and also the increase of the extreme ideologies in Syria contributes also in justifying violence against women, against their religious and national and some traditions. Besides this, also the enforcement, also the dictator organizations in the different regions in Syria, from the Bashar al-Assad regime, also to the Kurdish Union Party, al-Nusra, and the Syrian opposition.
Thank you.
This is for the first question. The second question, shall I answer it now or after?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Also very important and interesting. And now, if there is no other question, I will leave the floor to Niccolò Figate-Lamanca, Secretary General of No Peace Without Justice, also to reply to this last intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gianfranco. It's my real pleasure to provide more thanks and conclusions to this meeting. Before I start, Mariam, I think you had another issue you wanted to address, if I understood correctly from the translation. Do you want to complete what you were saying before?
Yes, because there were two questions also, or her job in Geneva. Do I have time to answer that question? The second question.
You absolutely do have time. Thank you.
Thank you once again. So as for the second question, being a member of the civil society support room in Geneva, this is a good opportunity to oversee and work with the international community. Unfortunately, frankly, the international organizations and UN organizations, they are not free of the international community policies, where they have their own interests at the head, where it is also they still give the support for on violence, watching on violence, where we see lots of cooperation and coordination between the international community and those forces who are controlling Syria, and also they are increasing the normalization with those forces, including the Bashar al-Assad regime, who all the Syrians see them as the main cause of the violence against women. What we want, in fact, what we are aiming at is that the UN organizations, UN agencies, and European organizations is to free themselves from the political decisions that are taken in the corridors of the UN organization, to divide between freedom and rights other than the political interest, and also to work on the accountability mechanisms for the criminals accused of violence and crimes, whether they are individuals or entities. What the Syrian women need today from the international organizations is to pressure on the Syrian parts who are negotiating now to find a political solution and drafting a Syrian constitution, and to have the woman her role in that constitution, and also to achieve equality and for the Syrian woman, and also to have the gender issues clear for the women rights as a main partner in the community, not to look at her with mercy and as partial. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mariam. I think you hit the nail on the head. The empowerment of women is exactly moving away from looking at women with, you said, mercy in Arabic. It's not a mercy, it's about rights, and it's not about giving things, it's about recognizing the right to have participation. I think with the time left, I really want to say thank you to Heba, to Mariam, to our Syrian partners that have conducted this study that gave rise to those recommendations, to those policy recommendations. This is not easy. I just want to say that it's not easy. It's not easy because it's very easy to go into communities and say, okay, what did the enemy did to your women? You know, your women, already the terminology, and the enemy is bad because they did things to our women, as if the women belonged to the community or to the men of the community. It was harder because this was about the experience of women that was a result of violations or denial of rights within their own communities. Not to minimize in any way the role of the war criminals. Bashar al-Assad was mentioned by Alessandro Moretti and his wife as somebody that should be in the forefront of those considered for sanctions by the European Union. And we know the work of the IIIM and of the human rights investigation by the COI. But it's harder to go and ask, okay, you know, the enemy did those things, but what happens to you today? What happens to you? Where are your rights being denied? Where, in the name of protection, you're not allowed to go to school? You know, where in the name of protection you're forced or given as if you were an object in early marriage to somebody else, whether from the host country, whether from a different country, whether within the community. Those violations are more insidious. Those violations are harder to tackle. And those violations are the ones that comprise the daily lives of refugee women, not just Syrian women in Turkey, but the response by the international community to the needs, let's say, of refugee women, focuses on material needs. It doesn't sufficiently focus on the right to be recognized as an agent. And I think this was the harder conversation to have, and Heba and her team and the partners that she has worked with were able to have that conversation precisely because they are part of the Syrian community. This particular field work was done in Turkey, but it was extremely important that it was done by Syrian women with Syrian women, and interviewing different types of groups with different experiences to get as much as possible a varied idea of the reality. I think what we learn is that ultimately the violations are ingrained in the way that the protection system is designed, which is, again, the very words we use. It's protection. Protection by denial of rights, of course, is no protection at all. And it reproduces the same dynamics that lead to oppression and have led, even in this case, patriarchal fascist dynamics that led to the most tragic conflict in the last 10 years in Syria, the consequences of which Syrian women and men still suffer, not just in the region, but also those who are still in Syria. So I think I cannot say anything more than Mariam and Heba have already said. with my deepest thanks to the members of the European Parliament that have brought their presence and their strength and their proposals and their willingness to bring those issues to the forefront of the political debate. So thank you to Alessandra, thank you to Eva, thank you to Brando. And looking forward to taking this more to a political level together. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolò. And I think that was the right way to conclude this very useful meeting and event. So I thank you personally, also our MEPs and our Syrian friends, and let's work again and again on this issue that is crucial to us and certainly also to you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye.
For our audience, we will have more civil society participants at a civil society edition of this, in which we will discuss more in detail both the work and the recommendations and what civil society can do. And that will be on the 30th of March. We'll see you there.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.